Hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining me. My name is Chad Johnson, and I'm the Information Security Officer and a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. I specialize in computer criminology and digital forensics, and for this year's Cybersecurity Forward virtual conference, my topic is analysis techniques and image forgery detection. So what you're about to see today is a very abbreviated version of a lecture taken from a forensic iconology unit that I include in my digital forensics course. I do have an exercise available to the public on the following website. This is just a GitHub site that I use for demonstrations and various different things. So if you head directly to that URL, you'll find the exercise posted online, along with a link to an archive that contains some images that you can use to complete the practice, if you'd like to follow along. First of all, forensic iconology is the study of visual imagery, that's pictures and video and symbolism that it contains in order to identify forensic artifacts. And we might do this in an investigation for a number of different reasons. We may use it to identify subjects, right? If there is a suspect or subject in the image, whether we believe it to be the victim or the perpetrator, or maybe just an associate, we will examine the imagery in an attempt to identify that individual. This is commonly done, for example, in cases of child exploitation and human trafficking, and it's one of the emerging areas in forensic iconology. We'll also do this to reconstruct timelines, right? If we have an individual, a subject whom we are investigating, we can use forensic iconology to go through image data in order to reconstruct timelines not only of the crime, but of maybe incidents leading up to it or directly after. We, of course, will do this to gather evidence, right? Sometimes imagery can be a terrific source of evidence. Sometimes it can be the only source of evidence, but they can say quite a bit. And images are often, unfortunately, direct evidence in many crimes, such as we mentioned, child exploitation. And what we're going to be focusing on today is we will also use forensic iconology to verify the authenticity of an image, because we are inundated with altered images every single day, and it becomes harder and harder for individuals to identify images that have been altered, or to ascertain the veracity of images that they're presented with merely upon cursory inspection. In short, the reason we do forensic iconology is because, as the old idiom says, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and a single image can tell quite a story if you have a trained eye and you can tease out the information that an image contains beyond what you see, beyond what is apparent. So today we are going to be focusing on verifying the authenticity of an image, so we sadly will not have enough time to go through all of the methods that are available to us in forensic iconology and cover every avenue that we possibly could. This is a very big topic, and normally one we spend at least a couple of weeks on at an undergrad level. So we're going to keep it brief and focus only on image alterations. Now, there are basic techniques that are available in forensic iconology. Those all can be used to detect image forgeries. At the top level, of course, we have mere observation, which is a very powerful tool. Even though it doesn't require any specialized equipment, it does require specialized training, and it is something that some people do tend to just be naturally better at than others. What we're talking about here is examining the image, not just to see what the visual information tells us, but what the circumstances of the image tell us. We break this into basic categories for observation. We have our substantive analysis, which is, of course, identifying the subject and the scene and everything inside of it. Then there's the contextual analysis. So every image tells a story. It's the story of that the photographer wanted to tell, right? If we're looking at an image of children in front of a tree at Christmas time, well, the photographer obviously wanted to tell the story of happy children on Christmas morning. But the very presence of the photograph tells a story as well, because not only did the photographer consider that moment important enough to capture, they considered the image important enough to preserve. In order for an image to appear before an individual, it had to have traveled. That alone can tell a story. So there is a contextual analysis of the image itself, the image in situ as it's found, and the image per se. Observation also includes something known as camera ballistics, and this is something of a misnomer, of course, because there's nothing ballistic about a camera. But what we're talking about is we're borrowing a term of forensic evidence associated with ballistics. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with CSI. Of course, we can examine the striation patterns on a projectile and then match that to a similar projectile fired from a weapon to determine whether or not the original projectile was fired from a particular firearm. Well, we can do the same thing with images. We can determine whether or not an image, based upon those same individual characteristics of evidence as we do with striation patterns on bullets, to determine whether or not an image was captured with the same camera. So what we're looking for are those individual characteristics, which we'll talk about in just a moment. We do image format analysis. Of course, images come in many different formats, and all of those formats have different idiosyncrasies associated with them. Those image file formats will also include metadata, and some of them include more metadata than other, and that can be quite a useful source of information. In addition to that, the image format may include quantization tables. It may be a lossy or lossless format, and that may be a source of information, and this can be particularly useful in detecting image forgeries. Then we will do some more hands-on forensic work using actual tools. Basic image enhancement is essentially using image editors like GIMP or Photoshop or even Paint in order to make fine adjustments of the image to reveal information that's not readily apparent upon first inspection. And then we have advanced image analysis, which is where we're using forensic techniques or forensic tools in order to examine image data that is present. Of course, it's not generating any new data, but it's not necessarily something that is visible even with basic image enhancement. It's something that requires forensic techniques in order to withdraw that information. Now, of course, we look at this image and we think, yes, this is definitely a Photoshop. There's no question about it. But we don't necessarily immediately instinctively know why we reach that conclusion somewhat instantaneously. Of course, in this case, it doesn't take long for us to be able to identify, if pressed, what exactly gives us a clue as to whether or not this is a Photoshop. But of course, eventually we realize, well, that's a cruise ship, and it's far too, either that's an incredibly small cruise ship or that's an incredibly large canoe. So essentially the size agreements don't match. We could go into more detail if you have the vocabulary to do so. We could say, the specular highlights don't match, the light source and shadows are in disagreement, and so on and so forth. Well, what we're doing there when we do that is simply a process of observation. And all of us, our human brains are particularly keen at parsing visual information. Now, that's sometimes a good thing and that's sometimes a bad thing. We're so keen at parsing visual information that sometimes we become overconfident. We take that for granted, and our eyes can be fooled. But at the same time, it also means that if you are trained to identify the correct features, and you're trained to ignore your biases and to ignore essentially these tricks that can be played upon you by artists who are doing image alterations, you can more readily identify and put to words the things that you observe in an image that lead you to believe that it may be altered. So we're going to begin first with observation. That is generally where image analysis begins. So first of all, when we're identifying altered images by observation, we're going to look for some of the same things that we look for in any investigation that involves the analysis of digital imagery. We're going to look for things like slippage and localisms. Slippage, of course, are things that the photographer didn't intend to be in the image but did somehow make it in there. This is most commonly done with reflections, whether that be glasses or mirrors or windows. Slippage also including things in the background that weren't intended, like things that are on computer monitors or on TV screens or whatever happens to be available. There have been many images posted to Social Image where slippage due to things in the background have been a real issue. There have been more than one post to social media where someone has posted a screenshot of their browser and it happened to have tabs open that the individual certainly didn't mean to broadcast publicly on social media. We also will look at computer monitors in the background of certain images because it can also be revealing as to what we might be dealing with, right? So if we're dealing with a computer criminal or a suspected computer criminal, and there's posts associated with them on social media, well, if they have a computer open, we may take a look and see what operating system they're working with, what applications they're working with, potentially even what versions of those applications they're working with, and that can be very useful to us. In terms of altered images, rather photoshops or altered images, these can also be useful because they can be areas where information made it into the image that weren't necessarily considered by the artist and can reveal disagreements between subject and scene with that slippage, which we'll get to in just a moment. Localisms are also important to look for. What we're looking for there are items that made it into the image that give us an idea as to whatever geographical qualities may be associated with the image. And this often also includes temporal qualities. Like, for example, if I see a picture of the town square in Stevens Point and there's no snow on the ground, I know that it was taken in roughly a 3-week period sometime around June. If we know that the image was captured in December and there's no snow on the ground, well, I know it's certainly not anywhere in Wisconsin. You see what I mean? It can also be useful if we're looking for like brand names, right? There are certain brands that aren't available in certain areas. So if we are, for example, investigating a human trafficking case and an image happens to be posted to social media by our subject, it doesn't include our victim, but we suspect that they are together, and we see that in the background is a Sonic drive-in. Well, then up north, there's going to be very few of those, much fewer than there are down south. It certainly would limit our geographical area. But if we also happen to see that they're at a Sonic and in the background is a palm tree, well, then we're certainly not dealing with the Sonic that happens to exist, I think, in Appleton, Wisconsin, right? We're certainly looking for somewhere else. And if we look in the background and we see that there is some textual data, right? There is a poster in the background, something posted onto the wall. Maybe a band is having a concert that night, and we see that the poster happens to be written in German. Well, that will make it much easier for us to find. There are going to be relatively few German communities that speak primarily German in the United States, with palm trees and a Sonic drive-in. Do you see what I mean? Identifying light switches and stuff, that can be particularly useful too, because of course different countries have different configurations for their outlets, for their power switches. US uses type A and type B with the 2 or the 3 prongs, but there are multiple types that are out there. And this can be useful in detecting imagery forgeries, because if if you see in the background that they happen to be, the background shows the Eiffel Tower, and the subject who posted it to social media is claiming that they are at the Eiffel Tower, but they happen to be looking out of their hotel window at the Eiffel Tower, and we see that there are type A plugs. They're not in France, right? Here's an example of slippage. We have here just an image that was captured that was made available via the CCO license. So it's just something that was posted. It's not my particular image, but it's something that could easily be in a catalog or something like that, right? It could be maybe they're selling the sunglasses, right? This would be a good image for that. You see that there's a woman with red hair. You see what she's wearing. You see that she is on a lake. And there are green plants in the background, but it's a blurry background, so you can't really see too much. But if we zoom in on those glasses, we can see, yes, there is a wealth of information that wasn't intended to be included. We see the photographer himself. We can even see that he is using a Nikon. We can see that there is a woman board on her phone in the background. The photographer's assistant is here. On the other side, we can see that this is a very large boat, not a small boat. So this is certainly not a fishing vessel. It appears to be a ferry of some kind. And we can see, even over here on far camera right, we can see that there's a couple minding their own business that incidentally made it into the shot. But how is this useful for image forgery detection? Well, this is a good example of how, right? So here we have a daredevil pilot hanging their head out the window as they're flying at 10,000 feet above some desert city. But if you look at the reflection in the image on the plane itself, you can see that it's false. This is an altered image. The plane is actually still on the ground. You can see the airport here reflected in that window. As I mentioned, camera ballistics is another way that you can detect image forgeries. It's a good way to match images to cameras. So if you have a known camera and you're trying to match images to it, let's say you have a subject in your investigation and you pick up a camera, right, either at the scene or something that you're able to acquire later, and you want to conclusively prove that an image was captured with that camera, well, individual characteristics may be a good way to do that. Individual characteristics of evidence, of course, are those that are created via incidental or accidental means. So the striation patterns on a projectile are a good example, which is where the term camera ballistics comes from. Now, of course, cameras, especially phone cameras, tend to go through quite a bit of abuse, and so they will invariably get scratched or dirty or somehow, and that can produce said individual characteristics. So if you have two images and they both happen to have a scratch visible in the image in the same location, well, then we are disambiguating quite a bit of evidence in this case. If you have 4 cameras picked up at the scene, it is very unlikely that they will all have a scratch in the exact same location. In terms of detecting image forgeries, this can be useful as well, because if it is a composite image and the composite image, the images that make up the composite are taken with a camera that possesses these individual characteristics, well, then you can tell where the composite images are coming from, which ones were taken with the camera, which ones maybe don't belong to the individual, and so on, right? So these characteristics will appear on all images captured with the camera, and they will persist if a portion of that image is cropped out and ported into a different image and pasted in order to create a composite image. It will carry those individual characteristics along with them. Next, I'd like to move on to basic image enhancements. So here we are just very simply putting the image into some kind of photo processor or an editor in order to make fine adjustments to reveal information that isn't otherwise apparent. In this image here, as you can see, there's a woman draped in a red cloth with her hands out. She appears to be surrounded by rain, and there's some smoke and a dark background. We can't really make out much of her as a person. It seems, at least artistically speaking, that her anonymity may even be an artistic choice. Well, we can do simple things here with basic image enhancement. We can adjust the color. There have been cases out there where a subject will intentionally mask. They will adjust the color values in their image in order to mask, for example, if it is a case of human trafficking. They may adjust the color balance in order to obscure the color clothing that the victim is wearing, right? They may adjust the brightness and contrast to hide things in the background. There may be useful information somewhere in the scene that requires zooming in order to determine. We'll get to that. But to see how powerful this can be, if we look at this image here, and we just adjust the brightness and contrast values, well, suddenly we have a lot more detail about our subject, and we can tell that this image was certainly altered, right? If we look at the smoke, which was previously just sort of in the background, well, by adjusting the contrast, we can clearly see that there have been some post-processing done. We can very clearly see these crisp lines in the smoke on the left and on the right, where the smoke has been cut and pasted and cloned. And we see that in many different places. So we can see that smoke is entirely artificial. It was not present when the image was captured. This can also be useful in detecting other types of alterations, as in a composite. As I mentioned before, our powers of observation with the human brain tend to be very powerful. It just needs to be tuned. So if we're looking for alterations in an image, we're looking for things like shadow disagreement or specular highlights, pattern detection. And if you're following along at home with the archive, that would be picture K9. You can take a look at for an example of that. We're also looking for things like seams and webbing and rooting, which we instinctively will see as being slightly off with our visual interpretations, but may not necessarily immediately understand that is a composite. As this dancer here, for example, you may not realize immediately that this is an altered image, right? It appears to be fairly organic, at least upon cursory inspection. However, even a moment of observation, you'll see that there is something certainly off with it. I'm not going to zoom in on this part, but if you look here above the subject's right foot, you'll see that there appears to be something that lingers there above the cuff in his pants. Certainly something was not cropped out correctly. But let's look down here at the left foot and zoom in on that. So here we have examples that we can detect with mere observation, and in this case using basic image enhancements, just zooming in order to see more clearly what is exactly wrong with this image. We have, for example, an issue with seaming. So when an image is captured by a camera, there is some natural diffusion with the subject and the scene. There will be some blending between the background and the foreground. Well, seaming is when there's this crisp line like you see here, right? This is clearly a cut and paste. Webbing is when the background, residual background data remains in between the fine details of the image. So the subject here, their foot is bare so we can see every toe, and that would be quite a bit of work for the artist to go in and get every single little pixel from the background out from between these toes, so they didn't bother. They merely cropped around it and were left with webbing, so this background information that's left between these fine details. And then lastly, we have rooting, right? So if we go back a bit, our subject is meant to seem as if they are dancing, yes? But if we zoom in on that foot, we can see that it's not quite right. So rooting is the subject's apparent location in space relative to the scene. The scene, of course, being the background, the subject being the foreground. So the subject is supposed to be dancing on the ground, but we can see he's not. He's floating a bit, and this is an issue with rooting. Just as an aside, very quickly, basic image enhancements can be very useful tools and techniques in detecting images that we know to be altered, but we cannot reveal the subject, as we saw with our subject who is in the dark draped in red. A perfect example of these techniques coming in handy is in 2007 with Interpol's Operation Vico. This was a case where there was a man who had been appearing in images that were being brokered through the black market, data black markets, appearing in images engaging in pedophilia with young boys. Now, this person attempted to obscure their identity by using an image editor to swirl out their face in an attempt to obscure their identity. Because of the proclivity of this person to do so, they earned the nickname in Interpol of Swirly Face. While using basic image enhancements, it's possible to discover that person's identity despite this attempt to destroy the evidence. The swirl feature in image editors relies upon a principle known as laminar flow, and there's a video linked in this slide if you would like to see it for yourself. I won't waste your time with it now, but suffice to say that essentially if the variables that went into swirling can be discovered, it can be reversed without really any distortion. So the Interpol agents, using the images that they discovered of Swirly Face, merely did a couple of calculations, a little trial and error, entered in those variables, and were, as you're able to see, reverse Swirly Face, and once again, discover his identity, which was Christopher Paul Neal, who was found, discovered, and arrested and is currently incarcerated. But back to image forgery detection, and let's move on to image format analysis. So image format analysis can be a very powerful tool in detecting image forgeries. This is also where the process of image forgery detection or investigations, forensic iconology, can begin to get quite complicated because there are so many different formats and all of them will have different data associated with them. At the most simple level, we have, of course, raw formats, which is little more than the image data itself. It's just pixel data, and it only has enough information present to reproduce that visual imagery. But that's very rare to be used because, of course, there's fewer bells and whistles, and there's also quite a bit of resource overhead involved with raw formats. So generally speaking, there are other formats that are in greater use, particularly the JPEG and the PNG. The PNG file tend to be the most common. Between the two of those, image formats are broken into two large categories. There's lossy formats and lossless formats. JPEG happens to be a lossy format, and PNG happens to be a lossless format. And that's why they're both particularly popular. JPEG right now is definitely the most popular with digital camera manufacturers, the most popular one in use everywhere, because it's a lossy format, and that means that the compression allows relative image data, so you can retain enough image data to certainly recognize and retain some quality in the image, but sacrifice a lot of the other data that eventually will cause it that makes it impractical to use in applications where you can't have large image files. PNG files tend to be popular because they are, well, two reasons. Partly because they're lossless, which means that fidelity remains regardless of the number of saves, but also because there's an alpha channel available in PNG files, meaning transparency is a possibility. This is important to keep in mind, especially when it comes to lossy file formats, because one of the ways that that evidence is discovered is with matching hash values, right? So there are going to be hash databases full of evidence. So if contraband images are discovered, the hash value can be added to a database of known contraband evidence. Because these things tend to be shared in certain dark web communities among certain individuals with a proclivity for the contraband material, that means it tends to make the rounds. It's one of the problems, right, when you're a victim of modern child exploitation, is that you may continually feel victimized because you know that somewhere at some point the images of your victimization are being viewed by somebody, which is a terrible, terrible thing. But because JPEG is a lossy format, that means that if the image is resaved, then the visual imagery changes, and that means the hash value changes. Whereas with a lossless format like PNG files, that's not the case. The hash value will remain the same regardless of the number of saves, as you can see here on this slide. So on the left-hand side, we have a JPEG file, we have the original, and then a copy was made and saved. And you can see that the MD5 hash value does indeed change, whereas on the right-hand side we have a PNG file, and the same thing was done to it, and the hash value doesn't change because the image data has remained the same. Those are the two most popular. They certainly aren't the only ones. There are many other popular file formats out there right now. There are GIFs, there are TIFFs, there are more file formats than I can possibly cover in just this single presentation. However, what I do want to mention is that those file formats do also contain other feature sets like EXIF information, that's extended image format information, which can contain a lot of metadata that provides a wealth of information as well. And that metadata can be used also to detect image forgeries. Right at the top level, one of the most dead simple ways you may determine whether or not an image has been altered is simply with the file name. Camera manufacturers need to come up with a unique name for every image that's captured in order to avoid potential collisions with images that already exist on disk. So in order to avoid doing that, they usually work off of some kind of a naming convention, which is almost always some kind of prefix, and then sequentially numbering them. There may be some collision detection available in there at a rudimentary level, but this is an easy way for them to prevent that from happening. So what that means is that if that name is changed, it may be an indication that the image has been altered. If, as you saw in the previous slide, there is an underscore copy, it may be an indication that it has been altered and the original was left alone to be untouched as a reference source later on. This also means that it is possible to do something called fusking. So if you receive a URL that goes to a link and the name hasn't been changed, the image file name hasn't been changed, then you may be able to guess other images in that series. So for example, if you receive a link that goes to image underscore 0001, maybe try 0002 all the way up to 9,999 to see how many images are available in the series. So deviations in the naming convention could be a clue that the image was altered, although of course it's not at all conclusive. There may be residual data associated with the image as well that may reveal that alterations have been made. So what you see here on this slide is the default sample image from a tool called Forensically, which we'll be using later on in this presentation, which is a fantastic tool in image forgery detection. And the sample image, as you can see here, there's a flying saucer and there appears to be somebody parachuting nearby. And of course, observation tells us this can't possibly be legitimate. We've not had conclusive evidence of UFOs yet. However, how do we prove that? Well, in this case, if we simply look at the thumbnail data, and thumbnail databases do contain image data, you can see the thumbnail for the image below clearly shows there's no UFO. There is somebody parachuting in the image, but it doesn't even seem to be the same person parachuting. So that person has been removed, and the UFO has been added, as well as another parachuter. So as I just mentioned, EXIF data, that metadata, can contain some clues as to whether or not the image has been altered. The camera, make, model, serial number, the date, time where it was taken, the GPS coordinates, all of this may be included in EXIF data. And EXIF data can be altered, but if it hasn't been, or if you can corroborate the information that you have in EXIF data, maybe with the image data itself or other associated evidence, it can be quite useful and can indicate, rather, whether or not something has been altered. As you can see in this example, there are two images which appear to be the same. On the left-hand side, you have one image, and then on the right-hand side, you have a separate image, and you can see that on the left-hand side, the software used is that string of letters and numbers, which if we were to run that just through a quick Google search, we would see that comes back to a Samsung S7. And if we're on the right, we can see that it says software used. We have GIMP version 2.8.20. So what that tells us is the image on the left, since the software used matches a Samsung S7, the equipment model matches a Samsung S7, the manufacturer matches a Samsung, we can say that this is what is known in forensic iconology as camera original. It hasn't been altered in any way. This is how it came right off the camera. That said, certain cameras do contain features that allow on-the-fly alterations, although that would be beyond the scope of this particular talk, but it is an interesting conversation to have. So certain things like panoramic shots or on-camera splicing, where it allows you to take two pictures and merge them together before the image data is saved on the camera. These are alterations that can take place on the fly on the camera. But this is an indication that it is camera original, so it's an indication that it hasn't been altered. Whereas on the right-hand side, clearly it has. Now, what alterations have occurred, we can't tell from this information, but we can say that at some point this image was imported and saved in GIMP. EXIF data can also contain a lot of information that can be very convincing as long as it can be corroborated. And the EXIF data can contain such an incredible amount of detail that it can be used to corroborate maybe information that may not even seem apparent at first. Like, for example, in this image that you see here on the left in this slide, there's a girl that's standing on some sort of a hill. Now, the EXIF data may have been altered, so it's possible, that we can't rely upon it. But if we're trying to corroborate what we see in the EXIF data, well, maybe we look at the timestamp. If the timestamp says it was taken at night, clearly the image has been altered, the EXIF data has been altered because this has not taken place at night. If it says that it was taken, if the GPS information indicates that it was taken in December in Wisconsin, well, that clearly isn't the case because there's no snow. But so that may be more obvious, right? That's apparent that we can corroborate that with the visual information. But we can also do something known as photogrammetry, which is useful in a number of situations, but in terms of detecting image alterations, it's very useful in corroborating that EXIF data. So in this case, what we have in photogrammetry is it's just simple trigonometry, right? We have a formula, and in this case, we can determine the distance to an object based upon that formula. So we have our focal length coming from EXIF data tells us that the value is 4.2 millimeters. Our subject appears to be between 5 and 7 years old, so we'll take the middle ground there and we'll say that she's 6. We see that the average height of a 6-year-old is about 45 inches or 1,143 millimeters. The image happened to be rotated on its side, so if we take the image height, in this case the image width, 4,032 pixels. We do the math on that one and we arrive at 19 million and change. For the second part of the formula, the subject is approximately half of the image, so half of 4,032 is 2,016 pixels. We take our sensor height, so in this case we look in the EXIF data and we find maximum aperture value is 1.35 millimeters. We do the math on that and we come up with 3,085. We do our calculation and we arrive at 6,274 millimeters, and if we convert that to American, we get between 20 and 21 feet. And now, going back to our visual imagery, and we take a look at our subject and we can say, yes, this could easily be corroborated to be between 20 and 21 feet, meaning that we can at least rely upon the EXIF values for focal length, for the image width, for our max aperture value, which lends some credibility to the other EXIF data that's in there as well, if we can equally corroborate that. We have an indication. Image format analysis also means quantization fingerprinting, and this is where things begin to get a little bit more technical. So essentially, when a JPEG image is captured, when a digital camera captures an image, ideally, in order to get the best possible image, quantization tables would be generated on the fly for every single image. And indeed, at the beginning of digital camera technology, it was the case, except we ran into problems where we would push the button to take an image and then it would take a second or two for the image to be processed. It just wasn't a good user experience, and it wasn't good. People expect cameras to take pictures fairly instantly. So in order to reduce the amount of time in image generation in digital cameras, it's necessary to use sort of default values for quantization tables. Quantization tables are values that are associated in pixel information, essentially, along 3 vectors. There's one quantization table for luminance, so the brightness value of each pixel, and then there is a quantization table for chrominance that is the value for red and blue. So essentially how bright a pixel is and the red and blue values of those pixels. And that is quantization tables. In JPEG images, all data is processed in banks of 8 by 8 or 16 by 16 pixels. So these quantization tables are 8 by 8 values that apply individually to each pixel, and it sort of allows the image to be generated much more quickly by using those default values. This also comes into play with image compression, which we'll get to in just a moment. So since these quantization tables are default values, they aren't shared industry-wide. They shouldn't be. The quantization tables from camera manufacturer to manufacturer and camera model to camera model should be different in order to make the images the best possible quality when taken on that device, which is a good thing for us, because that means that these quantization tables tend to be fairly unique, and so we can match quantization tables to cameras, hence quantization fingerprinting. So if I have a JPEG image that is camera original and I was told that it was taken with a Nikon D40, I can check the quantization tables, do some quantization fingerprinting, and match the quantization table on that image, and it should match the quantization tables to a Nikon D40. Perfect. This can be used in image forgery detection because image editing software also requires their own quantization tables. So when an image is imported into an image editor, the quantization tables need to be applied to that image in order to best present that image within the editor. Here you see the quantization tables for Adobe Photoshop 12. Now, Photoshop also happens to be a special animal because when you import an image into Photoshop, it automatically makes some alterations to that image. It will automatically adjust the brightness, the contrast, and the sharpness in order to present the best possible image to you as you're doing your editing. So essentially, the EXIF information will change, as we saw with GIMP, but the quantization tables for an image that's saved in an image editor will also change as well, showing that it was altered. Quantization tables also come into play when it comes to JPEG compression. So essentially, when JPEG is saved, it undergoes a process of compression. This is where quantization comes in. So the quantization table, when compression occurs, the value in the quantization table is divided by the value of that pixel, again in 8 by 8 or 16 by 16 pixel squares. When this happens, anything left over after the decimal in this process of division is truncated, so image data is lost. Essentially, everything is kind of rounded down in the image. So essentially, when a JPEG is first created, it is at 100% quality, and it is as complex as it's ever going to be. As it is saved, essentially it becomes simplified and simplified and simplified until there's relatively little image data left. Now, this quantization process also occurs when the image is decompressed, and then the image data in the pixels are multiplied by the value in the quantization table. So for example, if we have a pixel and the value associated with that pixel is 124, but the entry in the quantization table is 50, it will be divided, 124 will be divided by 50, which results in 2.48. Everything after the decimal is truncated, giving us a compressed pixel image data value of 2. When decompressed, when we want to view that image again, that 2 is divided again by the value in the quantization table, which is 50, giving us 100. So we've lost about 20% of the original image data for that pixel. And this happens every single time that the image is compressed. So there may be a point of diminishing returns where it seems like compression apparently doesn't have any effect, but also remember that the compression quality is another variable that may impact the amount of compression available, or the amount of the value that is applied in the quantization table. Here's a little visual representation showing roughly how image compression works. So here you see there is a very simple JPEG image. The one on the top is our original. The one on the bottom is our compressed image. You can see the version at the top, very complex image data, right? These are all 8 by 8 squares of image data. So these are 8 pixels by 8 pixels. And then these 8 pixel by 8 pixel blocks are made up into additional 8 pixel by 8 pixel blocks, or 8 by 8 blocks rather. Our original is quite complex, right? There's a lot of nuance in these pixel values. But when compressed, it all kind of gets rounded, right? And it becomes simplified. And while in an image like this, our simple happy face here, it's so simple that not a lot of fidelity is lost. It looks identical to our eyes. If the image were more complex, we would probably see something a little bit different. So if we look at something like this, on the the left-hand side is our original, on the right-hand side is our compressed image. You can see in a more complex block of visual data how much fidelity is lost, right? The lower right-hand portion in the compressed image becomes a black blob, and there are far fewer variants in the gray values, and just in general, it's greatly simplified. At an extreme rate, when we do as much compression as we possibly can, you can see that there is a quality factor that can be approximated in the quantization values as well. So on the left-hand side with our original image, we can see that based on the values in the quantization table that currently exists, that the approximate quality factor is 100. So this is our camera original image. This is as much quality as this image has ever had or will ever have. Whereas on the right-hand side, we have the same image that has been heavily compressed. And we can see that it's only about, well, it's at a fraction of the quality value that it once had. This is another way that you can detect alterations in an image, right? If the quality factor is 100%, that is an indicator that it may not have been altered, right? Because it hasn't been saved. It's still completely, the integrity is still completely preserved. Whereas this one, you would have a hard time determining how it was altered because it's undergone so much compression that there's very little image data that's left. And to show you what that looks like, I can point to these images here. On the left-hand side is that original image, and on the right-hand side is our heavily compressed image. And you can see it's lost so much visual information, particularly when it comes to colors, that it's greatly simplified. It looks like a bitmap image circa 1995 or 1996. It's terrible quality. You can still see what it is. It's a girl running next to a fountain, but you can see that the pavement, which was a hue of browns and grays, has been simplified to the lowest common denominator of gray, and in some places pink or this sort of beigey color. The sky, which was a nuance of white and blues, is mostly white except for where it was mostly blue, which is now just sort of an aqua color, and so on. So since these visual images are in 8x8 blocks, compression, when it simplifies the visual imagery data, will also cause what's known as JPEG artifacts, which are chunks, blocks that appear around the fine details in the image. So you can see in the previous image here that I showed you, it's very chunky, and you can see practically that there are, it's pixelated. But this is compressed to the point where it's not really a very good demonstration. So here we have a grayscale picture. On the left-hand side is the original, on the right-hand side is the compressed image. This has enough detail and the compression is light enough that you can scarcely tell that it's been compressed at all. But if we were to take a zoom in on some finer details, we would see over here on the left-hand side is our original image. On the right-hand side is our compressed image. You can see that the quantization values have changed and the image has been reduced. And the fine details on the left-hand side are intact, but on the right-hand side we have those JPEG artifacts, this chunking that comes in here, these 8x8 pixels. The image has been simplified to the point where now we have some halos appearing around those details. So that those JPEG artifacts are also known as errors, which brings us to our first advanced image analysis technique, error level analysis. So those errors, those artifacts, can basically mean that they're the result of compression and they appear as a result of fine details in the image data. Meaning that we run into a situation that's quite serendipitous for us as investigators, as applying forensic iconology. It's mathematically improbable for two images to have identical error patterns because different subjects, different scenes, different compression levels, different noise values. Alterations in those images will alter those noise patterns, the error patterns rather, and those patterns can be detected with the right tool. So, for example, on the left-hand side we have our original image, and on the right-hand side we have an altered image. In this case, there's nothing nefarious or hilarious put in. This image has been altered in the same way that we experience altered images on a daily basis. We are inundated with altered images. Almost every advertisement we see contains, not almost, every advertisement we see contains altered images. In magazines, television, everywhere on the internet, advertisements contain altered images to the point where we begin to have difficulty spotting the alterations because it's just so much noise. But using error level analysis, we can determine exactly how this image has been altered, and in this case altered in the form of an advertisement to make it more aesthetically appealing. So if we run these through error level analysis, you can see on the left-hand side, the error pattern is fairly uniform. It appears as we would expect it to appear in an organic photo. There are very few error levels around the details. You can see the lines around the contrasting areas remains fine. There's little chunking as opposed to this one. Error levels have been introduced as a result of compression and then enhanced by sharpening the image. And you can see around the cow's nose and everywhere else there are those pixelated qualities, those blocks of JPEG artifacts that are left behind. You can see the error levels are increased everywhere that the image has been altered, the eyes and the ice cream, which were changed in color and made to appear more vibrant, in this case to make the product appear more appealing. The colors have been enhanced, right, to make the reds more vibrant. The contrast has been changed to make the difference between lights and darks greater and more dramatic, which you can see here with the darker spots and the highlight around the red and the lips and the green in the background. You can also see that the error pattern is altered around the head, where some of the flyaway hairs have been airbrushed, and on the face. In our original image, our subject had a little ice cream on her nose and on her cheeks, and in order to make it more aesthetically appealing, those were removed in our advertisement. So using error level analysis, we can clearly see how this image has been altered. Now, it can also be used to detect alterations for composite images. So what you see here is an image, and the question is, how has it been altered? I'll go ahead and give away that it has been altered, but how? Using error level analysis, it becomes quite simple. Now, most students, when presented with this in class, they do error level analysis, and they'll first say, a lot of them get tripped up, and they say, well, these lights on the left-hand side, these yellow lights, are entirely fabricated. They are not organic to the picture. But if we look at the error level analysis of this image, you can see, yes, those lights do stand out. However, when doing error level analysis, it's important to match like to like, and this is our only warm light source. This is our only yellow light source. However, we have many white light sources of varying intensity. There are many white objects. And if we compare like to like, we can see that the poster in the background, though it should match the white values in our other objects, it clearly does not. It stands out like a sore thumb. That is because that poster is our composite. It was pasted from an image that had greater error values, making it quite obvious. And once it's apparent, you will probably also notice through observation that it's not quite in line with where the poster should be on the wall, which your eyes may initially ignore as merely being a mistake, but it becomes quite apparent that it's because it's fake. So here we have that image. In this case, it's not altered to be an advertisement. We can see that there is a Yeti in the background. And I can assure you, this is not proof of Bigfoot's existence. This is an altered image, but how do we prove that? Well, in this case, we're going to use another advanced image analysis technique known as noise analysis. So when an image is captured, it's captured by a digital device. An image is digital data, and it will naturally contain noise. There's going to be a noise pattern embedded in the image. That noise pattern is part background radiation, right? We're surrounded by electromagnetic radiation all of the time, and that creates electromagnetic noise. The camera itself is a digital device, and so it will also have electrical components that will generate electromagnetic radiation, generating a noise. So cameras will have internal noise, and there will be external noise, and that noise will be embedded in the image. If we can suppress the visual image and only retain the noise patterns, then we can quite clearly see that the Yeti was pasted in. It is a composite. It was pasted from an image that has a completely different noise pattern. Now bear in mind that noise patterns, when you're doing a noise analysis, they tend to be relative representations. So if we were to look at the original image that the Yeti was taken from, the noise pattern may look different to us, but because the noise patterns are so disparate in these two images in this composite, we can very clearly see the Yeti does not belong, whereas everything else, the cow, the ice cream, the girl, the building in the background, it all blends together in this nice, natural, organic noise pattern. I actually have an exercise that I can show you in how to detect these composites. And so what we have here are two images. This is forensically, by the way. I highly recommend playing around with it if you're interested. It is a fantastic tool. But we have two images of the same subject, different scenes. And the question is, how do we tell which one is our original and which one is our composite? Well, using noise analysis. If we look at our first image, we can see, again, the noise pattern is nice and consistent and organic throughout. Whereas the other image, we can clearly see, not only is this a composite taken from two different images with different noise patterns, but we can also see that the edges were blended in order to hide the fact that it was a composite. We can also use noise patterns to detect, do some form of camera ballistics to detect which images go with which cameras. So here we have 4 images of toys, and if we do noise analysis on all of these and look through them, we can see our first image has a noise pattern that has odd concentric circles embedded into it. They radiate out from the center. I don't know if you can see that in the video, but I assure you that they're there. There's radial patterns, noise patterns emanating from the center of the image. Our second image has no such radial patterns. There's a nice uniform noise pattern across the entire image. Our second image also, our third image also has a nice uniform pattern across the image, while our fourth has the same concentric radiating noise pattern. So with that, we can say that image 1 and image 4 were captured with the same camera, and image 2, assuming that there are only 2 cameras possible, then 4 and 1 were taken with one camera, and 2 and 3 with the other camera. Another tool at our disposal in image forgery detection and when it comes to advanced image analysis is what's known as principal component analysis, and I'm running short on time, so I will hurry. But essentially, principal component analysis will break an image out into its component parts based upon 3 factors, basically according to variance across across the image data. So if we take an image like this, and we were to take a look at it, well, we can see that this image was altered, because if we look at her right hand, camera left, we can see that she's got straps in her hand that don't go anywhere, right? So there used to be a handbag in her hand. But what else was altered? That may be less easy to identify, especially since we have the distracting missing handbag to contend with. Well, if we do principal component analysis, we can clearly see where the alterations take place. We can see that the background looks blurry, so that's an artificial blur. We can see the blotch where the handbag used to be, and maybe that could help us identify what bag it was based upon its size. We can see that there's clear editing around here. We can see that those JPEG artifacts, the pattern has been altered, and that's readily visible with principal component analysis, particularly around the arms on both sides, here and here. We can see that the dress appears to be fairly clean, but there are JPEG artifacts from alterations down here on the dress, and also here on the camera left, her right side of her chest. Next and finally, we have wavelet transformation. So wavelet transformation is basically only viewing partial image data. So if we have an image that is 800 by 600 pixels, and we were transmitting that image via half duplex radio, we would only be able to transmit 1 pixel at a time, which means that we would have, and each of those transmissions is a wavelet. So 800 times 600, we would need to make 480,000 transmissions or wavelets in order to view the entire image data. But you don't need all of the image data in order to view an image, right? You can get the gist of something, right? You don't need complete information in order to understand what the image is. As they say, there are 2 types of people in the world: those who can extrapolate from incomplete information. So if we have half of our image data or 10% of our image data, we may still be able to tell what the image is of. But if the image has been altered, that may be revealing if we only have partial wavelets, right? So if we have this image, which again, clearly a composite, but how do we prove that? Well, if we decompose the waveforms and only view some of them, you can clearly see the Pegasus and the Fisherman stick out like a sore thumb. They are made up of a different number of wavelets from another image that was maybe more or less complex than the one in which it was pasted. So that is it for me. I am out of time. I thank you so much for your attention. I hope that you found this topic to be interesting and maybe learned something. Here is my contact information. If you do, if you want to talk about this or you want to touch base later, I welcome anyone and everyone contacting me. I love talking about this stuff, and I love working with people on it. If you'd like to read more about this subject, I do have a couple of works soon to be published that includes forensic iconology, among other topics related to this. So thank you again. Thank you very much. And thank you to Cybersecurity Forward for having me again. I will potentially be seeing you next year. It's always great fun to do this and share my information with everybody else. So thank you. Thank you so much.